What if I told you that the fate of the entire world once depended on a single naval signal? At the beginning of the 19th century, Europe bowed to the will of one man whose ambitions knew no bounds. Napoleon Bonaparte was redrawing the map of the continent, sweeping away ancient monarchies and establishing a new order. The only barrier between him and absolute power was a narrow strait in the wooden walls of the British fleet. The stakes were incredibly high. If the French emperor gained control of the English Channel for just 6 hours, England would cease to exist. Watch the video to the end to find out how one man with one arm and one eye was able to stop the most powerful military machine of his time and change the rules of warfare at sea forever. What if I told you that everything you believed about the impregnability of Britain hung in the balance? In 1805, on the French coast at Boulogne, a grand scene of invasion preparations was unfolding. Napoleon had assembled a huge force here, known as the Grand Army, ready to cross the Channel at any moment. Thousands of landing barges stood in the harbors, waiting for only one thing: cover from the Navy. Soldiers trained daily in boarding ships and landing on shore, perfecting their actions to the point of automatism. The emperor personally supervised the exercises, dreaming of the day when his legions would march through the streets of London. The atmosphere in England in those days was like a string stretched to breaking point, ready to snap at any moment. Defensive towers were built along the coast, and militias were hastily taught how to use muskets. People gazed anxiously at the foggy horizon, waiting for the appearance of French sails. Newspapers were full of caricatures of the Corsican monster, but behind the laughter lay genuine fear. The British Admiralty understood that their only hope was the Royal Navy blocking enemy ports. French and Spanish ships were locked in their harbors, unable to join forces. Napoleon needed a complex maneuver to distract the British and gather his forces into a fist. He devised a daring plan that required incredible precision and courage from his admirals. The key figure in this plan was French Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, a cautious and hesitant man. He was ordered to break through the blockade, sail to the West Indies, and lure the British fleet away. Then he was to return swiftly, join forces with other squadrons, and enter the English Channel. It was a game of cat and mouse on an oceanic scale. The British fleet in the Mediterranean was commanded by Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, a living legend and national hero. He had lived on a ship for years, exhausting himself and his crew with endless waiting for the enemy. His ships were battered by storms, and supplies were often running low. But the spirit of the crews was sustained by the incredible charisma of their leader. Nelson understood the enemy's plan and was ready to pursue Villeneuve to the ends of the earth. When the French fleet finally broke out of Toulon, a great chase across the Atlantic began. The ships traveled thousands of miles, battling winds and currents, but never engaging in battle. When Villeneuve reached the Caribbean Sea and learned that Nelson was breathing down his neck, he panicked and turned back. Napoleon's plan began to unravel because of one man's fear of another's genius. Instead of breaking through to the English Channel, the combined Franco-Spanish fleet took refuge in the Spanish port of Cadiz. Napoleon was furious, accusing his admirals of cowardice and incompetence. He ordered Villeneuve to immediately set sail and fight the British or go to Italy. Upon learning that the emperor had already sent his replacement, the admiral decided to set sail to save his honor. This decision proved fatal for thousands of sailors. A huge armada of 33 ships of the line began to slowly leave the harbor of Cadiz. They were met by a British fleet of 27 pennants, already lined up in battle formation. The stage was set for the greatest naval drama. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. Do you think Villeneuve could have refused to carry out the emperor's suicidal order? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the strategy that broke all the rules of warfare? Traditional naval tactics of the time dictated that fleets line up in two parallel lines and fire at each other. This allowed all the guns on board to be used, but rarely led to a decisive victory and the complete destruction of the enemy. Battles often ended in a draw or minor losses on both sides, after which the fleets would disperse for repairs. Nelson despised this approach, considering it a waste of time and resources. He wanted not just victory, but the complete destruction of the enemy fleet. He developed a plan that would later be called Nelson's Touch, which was radical and incredibly risky. The idea was to abandon the line formation and attack the enemy with two perpendicular columns. This meant that his ships would have to sail straight into the enemy's guns, unable to return fire at the beginning of the engagement. Such a maneuver allowed the enemy's formation to be cut in 2 or 3 places, creating chaos and confusion. Breaking the line deprived the Franco-Spanish fleet of unified command and the ability to transmit signals. The enemy's center and rear guard were caught in the crossfire of superior forces until the vanguard could turn around and come to their aid. Nelson gathered his captains in the flagship's cabin and explained the essence of the plan to them. He called them brothers in arms and gave each of them freedom of action within the framework of the overall plan. The main rule was a simple instruction. No captain will go wrong if he puts his ship side by side with the enemy's. The risk was enormous. The lead ships of the British columns were subjected to fierce fire as they approached. They could be blown to smithereens before they even fired a shot. But Nelson believed in the skill of his gunners and the strength of English oak. He also counted on the slow rate of fire of the French and Spanish artillerymen. British crews could reload their guns 2 to 3 times faster, which gave them a decisive advantage in close combat. In addition, the morale on British ships was immeasurably higher. On the morning of October 21st, 1805, the fleets sighted each other off Cape Trafalgar. The wind was light, and the ships moved painfully slowly, allowing time for final preparations. Nelson stood on the deck of his flagship, the Victory, dressed in full-dress uniform with all his medals. Many officers asked him to remove his decorations, which made him an excellent target for snipers. But the admiral refused, saying that he had lived in honor and would die in honor. He understood that his presence on deck inspired the sailors. Before the battle began, Nelson ordered the famous signal to be raised. England expects every man to do his duty. This signal was met with a thunderous hurrah from all the ships in the squadron. Every sailor knew what was required of him at this decisive hour. The fleet slowly drew closer, and the tension grew with every passing minute. The silence was broken only by the creaking of rigging and the lapping of waves against the wooden sides. In the next chapter, you will learn how this hell on water began. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of courage? The first to enter the battle was the column commanded by Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood on the ship Royal Sovereign. This ship, recently repaired and fitted with new copper plating on its bottom, was faster than the others. Its speed became a decisive advantage, allowing it to break away from the pack, leaving its allies behind. Thus, it became the sole target for dozens of enemy guns, which immediately opened fire on the lone giant. The French and Spanish wasted no time and unleashed a barrage of fire on the British ship. They hoped to knock down its masts and deprive it of its ability to maneuver, because stopping the Royal Sovereign would prevent a breakthrough. The water around the ship boiled from the falling cannonballs, turning the surface of the sea into chaos of foam and smoke. The sails were torn and turned into a sieve, but the ship stubbornly held its course. Collingwood led his ship straight to the center of the enemy line and did not respond with a single shot. The silence of the British guns at that moment seemed ominous. While enemy volleys shook the ship, the crew lay on the deck, waiting for orders, realizing that it was pointless to fire too early. The men endured agonizing moments when each cannonball could be their last. This training required iron discipline and complete trust in their commander, who stood confidently at his post and watched the approaching enemy line. Finally, the Royal Sovereign broke through the enemy formation, passing directly under the stern of the Spanish flagship Santa Ana. This was the moment for which Collingwood had endured the bombardment. Now, in the perfect position, he ordered his left side to open fire. The guns were loaded with double shot, and when the volley thundered, it struck the Spanish ship in its most vulnerable spot. The destruction was terrible. With a single volley, the British disabled many guns, pierced important bulkheads, and killed hundreds of sailors. After that, the Royal Sovereign found itself in the middle of a veritable hell. It was surrounded by a ring of 5 enemy ships, each trying to deliver a fatal blow. A fierce battle ensued, with the ships standing almost side by side, firing at each other. Black powder quickly turned the entire area into a thick smokescreen, through which even the sun could not be seen. The men fought almost blindly, guided only by the sound and flashes of gunfire. Meanwhile, the rest of Collingwood's ships approached one after another. They entered the gaps created by the Royal Sovereign and cut into the enemy's formation, breaking through it again and again. The ships maneuvered boldly between the enemies, cutting off their rearguard from their main forces. Thus, Nelson's plan began to work to its fullest extent. He turned the organized Battle of the Allies into a series of separate duels, where British captains could show personal initiative. The British gunners worked with incredible speed and accuracy, firing shot after shot at a rate that astonished their opponents. They showered the decks with grape shot, knocking out the crews from the upper decks and destroying all preparations for boarding. Amidst this furious firing, the French attempted to board and storm the British ship, but the wave of fire swept away even the boldest attempts. Meanwhile, despite its fallen mass and enormous damage, the Santa Ana continued to fight back. The Spaniards fought with desperate bravery, even though their ship was gradually turning into a floating wreck. Debris from the rigging, cracked beams, and broken guns lay everywhere. But even surrounded and deprived of most of their combat capability, the Spanish sailors stubbornly refused to lower their flag. In this chaos, command of the fleet became a task that could not be solved centrally. Flag signals were lost in the smoke, and each captain acted on his own initiative. It was precisely for such conditions that Nelson had prepared his men. He taught them to make decisions independently, to see the target and attack it without hesitation. This made the British fleet flexible and fast, capable of winning even in the most confusing conditions. Gradually, Collingwood's column engaged a significant part of the enemy fleet, depriving the Allies of the opportunity to carry out complex maneuvers. The enemy ships were forced to fight in close quarters, where the advantages of heavy battleships were lost. Now all eyes were on the second column, led by Admiral Nelson himself. The final turning point in the battle and the outcome of the entire battle depended on its strike. If you like reading about such daring maneuvers, don't forget to like this post. Guess what happened next when Nelson's flagship approached the enemy? The Victory, Nelson's flagship, led the windward column, moving straight towards the center of the combined French-Spanish line. It sailed confidently and persistently, despite the fact that the enemy had seen its advance in advance and tried to seize the initiative. The main target remained Admiral Villeneuve's flagship, Bucentaure, but it was extremely difficult to identify it among dozens of masts, flags, and thick gunpowder smoke. The Victory was unable to open fire for several tens of minutes, as the approach was at an acute angle that prevented the use of the ship's guns. All this time, several ships were firing at the British flagship. The enemy's guns covered it with heavy fire, and the sailors understood that every new minute of the approach could be their last. Despite this, the ship continued to move forward, maintaining its formation and composure under heavy fire. During those 40 minutes, the Victory was literally riddled with holes. The sails hung in tatters, the ropes snapped one after another, and splinters from broken beams lay around the helm. The losses were heavy, and many of those who had been working on deck just moments before now lay motionless. But the crew, hardened by long service, continued to carry out orders, keeping the ship on course. A particularly frightening moment came when a cannonball pierced the hull and killed Nelson's personal secretary, who was standing next to the admiral. Blood spattered the railings, but Nelson, as before, kept a stoic expression on his face. He continued to discuss maneuvers with Captain Hardy, seemingly oblivious to what was happening around him, and his calmness kept up the morale of everyone who saw him on deck. When the smoke finally cleared slightly, the Victory discovered a narrow gap between the hulls of the Bucentaure and the Redoutable. The maneuver was extremely risky, but it was the only way to strike Villeneuve's flagship. The British ship passed so close to the stern of the Bucentaure that it seemed as if the yards would collide with each other. Many on the decks of both ships froze, realizing that a volley of enormous force was about to follow. This volley was indeed devastating. The guns of the Victory, preloaded with triple charges of grape shot and cannonballs, literally tore apart the stern of the Bucentaure. The force of the impact swept away entire crews, and internal bulkheads flew apart along the entire hull. The French flagship lost control almost instantly and became a stationary target, its decks covered with a cloud of splinters and dust. While the Bucentaure was recovering from the blow, the Victoire continued its movement and rammed into the side of the Redoutable. The two ships became entangled in their rigging, as if locked in a deadly duel. A fierce close-range firefight ensued, and the battle became much more personal, almost hand-to-hand. French Captain Lucas had indeed prepared his men for such a confrontation, relying on their marksmanship and ability to fight at close range. From the Mars of the Redoubtable, the marksmen fired bullets with almost no misses. They hit those on the upper deck of the Victory, and the British had to struggle to find cover. Hand grenades thrown from above by the French exploded among people and equipment, causing flashes of fire and dangerous debris. It seemed that the upper deck was about to be completely overwhelmed. Despite the chaos above, the British still had a clear advantage on the lower decks. There, heavy guns designed to pierce thick hulls were in action. The Victory's cannons fired at point-blank range, and each shot inflicted terrible damage on the Redoubtable. The cannonballs flew through the French hull and exited the opposite side, hitting even those ships that were too close. The damage to the Redoubtable grew with each volley, but its crew continued to resist desperately. For a while, it seemed that the French would be able to maintain the initiative thanks to their superiority in gunnery. However, the situation worsened when the British ship Temeraire approached the scene of the battle, finding itself in an advantageous position to support the Victory. Caught between two British ships, the Redoubtable was forced to take fire from both sides. This turned it into a target with almost no chance of escape. Nevertheless, the French showed remarkable resilience, and the scenes on their decks were filled with tragic determination. A ring of smoke formed around the locked ships, so thick that it was often impossible to distinguish even the nearest ship. People could only orient themselves by the flashes of gunfire and the cries of the wounded. The roar of the cannons mingled with the crack of breaking rigging, and all this cacophony created the impression that the sea itself had been drawn into the battle. The cluster of ships gradually expanded as new vessels from both sides converged on the battlefield. Some of them were no longer able to control their maneuvers due to damage and literally crashed into neighboring ships. This turned the battle line into a chaotic mess, devoid of its former formations and plans. Meanwhile, fire continued to destroy the inner decks of the Redoubtable. The bilge pumps were barely coping, and the crews responsible for keeping the ship afloat were working almost blindly. The situation was similar on the Victoire, but the French ship had suffered far more damage and had more holes. With each new shot, it became clear that this section of the battle had become the center of the entire Battle of Trafalgar. Here, the interests of the commanders, the courage of the sailors, and the tension that had built up over many months of confrontation converged. The outcome of the clash gradually affected the position of ships across the battlefield. It was in this part of the battle that the fate of the entire campaign was decided. The loss or success of the flagships would determine the further actions of the fleets and possibly even the course of the entire war. Hours of heavy fighting still lay ahead, but it was this battle that became its heart. Could you keep your cool in the midst of such chaos? At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, in the midst of the battle with the Redoubtable, an event occurred that shook the entire British fleet. Nelson and Captain Hardy were walking on the deck, watching the battle unfold. Suddenly, the admiral fell to his knees, leaning his hand on the deck, and then fell on his side. A gunner from the Redoubtable, standing only 15 meters away, saw the bright star of the order on the officer's chest and pulled the trigger. The lead bullet entered his left shoulder, shattered a rib, pierced his lung, and lodged in his spine. Nelson immediately realized that the wound was fatal, saying to Hardy, who had rushed up to him, "They have finally finished me off." In order not to undermine the morale of the crew, the admiral covered his face in medals with a handkerchief as he was carried to the infirmary. Downstairs, in a stuffy, dark room full of wounded and dying men, he was laid on a makeshift bed. The ship's surgeon, after examining the wound, could only ease his suffering but not save his life. Despite the terrible pain and his fading strength, Nelson continued to demand reports on the progress of the battle. He constantly asked how many enemy ships had already surrendered. The noise of the battle above, the roar of cannons, and the cries of men reached him, and each volley from the Victory brought him satisfaction. Meanwhile, on deck, the sailors of the Victory, learning of the wounding of their beloved admiral, fought with redoubled fury. They literally swept away the resistance of the Redoubtable, raining down a barrage of fire on it. The French ship, having lost more than 80% of its crew, was forced to surrender. Captain Hardy regularly went down to his dying friend, bringing news of the victory. First, he reported 5 ships surrendered, then 10. Nelson whispered, "That's good, but I was counting on 20. Life was slowly leaving the great naval commander. His breathing became heavier and his voice weaker. He gave his last orders, worrying about the fate of his beloved Lady Hamilton and his daughter. His thoughts were not of glory, but of the people he was leaving behind. The admiral's closest officers, chaplain and servants gathered around the dying man. This scene in the dimly lit hold of the ship became one of the most tragic and majestic in British history. The man who destroyed France's naval power was dying at the moment of his greatest triumph. Nelson's last words were, "Thank God I have done my duty." At about 4:30 in the afternoon, when the cannonade began to subside, the admiral's heart stopped. The news of his death quickly spread throughout the fleet, mixing the joy of victory with the bitterness of loss. This loss became a national tragedy for Britain, but it also cemented Nelson's status as an immortal hero. Are you ready for the shocking truth about the size of ships of that era? While Nelson was dying, the battle continued with unrelenting ferocity in other areas. Particular attention was drawn to the Spanish giant Santísima Trinidad, the largest warship in the world. This 4-decked monster with nearly 140 guns seemed like an indestructible floating fortress. British captains, like a pack of wolves, pounced on this giant. The Santísima Trinidad was surrounded by several ships that bombarded it with fire from different sides. Despite the strength of its sides, the giant was unwieldy and unable to respond effectively to attacks from more maneuverable opponents. The Spanish sailors fought heroically, but the wooden walls of their ship could not withstand such pressure. The giant's masts collapsed one after another, turning the deck into chaos with sails, ropes, and debris. The ship lost control and became a huge immovable target. In the end, the pride of the Spanish fleet was forced to lower its flag. The sight of the fallen giant became a symbol of the complete collapse of the Allied fleet. It proved that size and number of guns do not guarantee victory against skill and tactics. On the other flank, the French vanguard under Admiral Dumanoir attempted to engage in battle, but did so too late. Instead of helping the center, they merely exchanged volleys with the British and withdrew. This action caused much controversy and accusations of cowardice after the battle. By the end of the day, most of the French and Spanish ships had been either captured or destroyed. The sea was littered with broken masts, barrels, and dead bodies. The victors and the vanquished were equally exhausted by the hours of slaughter. The captured prizes were a pitiful sight. Hold hulls, broken masts, fires. British sailors had to rush to transfer to the captured ships to prevent them from sinking and to extinguish the fires. It was hard and dangerous work, often carried out side by side with recent enemies. One of the most frightening threats after the battle was the explosion of powder magazines on burning ships. The French ship Achille caught fire, and despite the crew's attempts to save it, exploded with terrifying force. The column of fire and smoke was visible for many miles, putting a terrible end to the battle. The victory was complete and unconditional. The British did not lose a single ship, capturing or destroying most of the enemy fleet, but the price was high. Thousands killed and wounded on both sides. The sea was stained crimson, reflecting the setting sun. Do you think the victory was worth such enormous sacrifices and the loss of the best admiral? Immediately after the battle ended, nature decided to test the sailors' endurance once again. It seemed that the participants in the battle had already survived the worst, but the sea had a new blow in store for them. Even before his death, Nelson warned of the approaching storm, as if sensing the breath of the elements. His words sounded like a final instruction that should be accepted without hesitation. Before his death, Nelson predicted a storm and ordered the fleet to drop anchor. It was a sober order from an experienced naval commander who knew how dangerous the ocean could become after a long cannonade. However, Collingwood, who took command after the admiral's death, did not immediately decide to carry out this maneuver. His doubts cost dearly because the ships continued to maneuver in the open sea, where they could be overtaken by any element. At night, a violent storm, one of the strongest in recent years, broke over the battered fleets. The sky seemed to split, and the gusty wind howled in the rigging as if the ocean itself were screaming in rage. Waves rose as high as houses, and crashed onto the decks with such force that people could barely stay on their feet. For ships that had been stripped of their masts, sails, and part of their steering after the battle, this storm was a death sentence. Waves as tall as houses tossed the ships like splinters. They lifted the huge hulls into the air and then slammed them down with a crash, as if playing with them. Many captains realized that their ships simply could not withstand such a test. Water poured into the broken sides, and sailors worked in completely flooded compartments, trying to maintain at least minimal control over their ships. The British prize crews on the captured ships were trapped. These men, left on the enemy ships to guard and manage the trophies, now had to fight for their lives. From morning till night, they pumped water, patched holes, and tried to reinforce what could still be reinforced. Many admitted that at such moments they no longer thought about victory, but only about surviving until dawn. They desperately tried to keep the trophies afloat, working the pumps until they were exhausted. There was no time to rest, and people often lost consciousness right on the decks. Interestingly, the French and Spanish prisoners who found themselves on board with the British also took to the pumps. They understood that everyone's fate was in the hands of everyone who was able to work. Thus, against the backdrop of war, a remarkable unity arose in the face of common misfortune. French and Spanish prisoners often worked the pumps alongside the English, saving their shared lives. Sometimes they would engage in brief conversations, in which there was no hostility, only weary human sympathy. They worked side by side, understanding that in such moments there were no nations or ranks. There were only people in the sea, which spared no one. Many captured ships were thrown onto the rocks of the Spanish coast and smashed to pieces. It was impossible to save them, especially when the storm raged to its fullest. The wooden hulls broke like toys, and the rushing water made any resistance futile. People jumped into the sea hoping to swim to shore, even though the distance seemed insurmountable. Others had to be deliberately sunk so that they would not pose a threat to the rest of the fleet. Captains gave such orders with a heavy heart, for each trophy had cost enormous effort. But it was better to lose a ship than to let it break loose from its anchor and strike its own. In the end, of the 19 captured ships, the British managed to save only 4, which was a serious blow to their expectations. The Santísima Trinidad, the pride of Spain, did not survive the storm and sank with hundreds of wounded on board. This ship, considered one of the largest in the world, had already been severely damaged in battle. The storm was its final test, and the sea swallowed it up, leaving only debris that was later washed ashore. It was yet another tragedy in a series of terrible events during those days. The people on board had hoped to survive the battle, but perished in the whirlpool of storm waves. It seemed that fate itself had decided not to spare anyone from trials. Thus, the elements completed what the cannons had begun, making no distinction between victors and vanquished. The crews of the British ships, exhausted by battle and storm, did not sleep for days. They patched holes, tightened rigging, and reinforced the last surviving masts. Every man knew that his actions determined not only the lives of his comrades, but also the safety of the fleet's flagships, which were barely staying afloat. The men were exhausted, but they continued to work. They showed incredible endurance as they tried to keep their ships afloat. The Victory, where Nelson's body was located, had a particularly difficult time. Despite the damage, the ship was able to withstand the huge waves and remain seaworthy. For many sailors, this became almost a symbol that the admiral's spirit continued to support them. The storm raged for several days, scattering ships across a vast area of water. Some ships drifted so far away that they were only found after a long time. The fleet lost its formation, and communication between ships was so disrupted that commanders were operating almost blindly. When the wind finally began to subside, the waters around them resembled the scene of a huge naval battle, with nature itself as the enemy. This prevented the British from fully enjoying the fruits of their victory. Part of the result was literally washed away by the waves, but the main achievement did not disappear. The enemy fleet had been destroyed as a force capable of threatening Britain, and this changed the balance at sea forever. The country could be sure that its communications would remain protected. Local residents on the Spanish coast watched in horror as the sea washed debris and bodies ashore. For them, it was a terrible sight, because among the dead could be people from many different countries. They gathered on the shore to pull survivors out of the water, and they did so without hesitation. Even in those difficult times, humanity remained stronger than enmity. Ultimately, the loss of the trophies was of no strategic importance. The British understood that the main event had already taken place. The enemy fleet had ceased to exist as a combat unit, and it was impossible to restore it. Even the sea, which destroyed some of the trophies, could not change the fact that the outcome of the campaign had been decided forever. If you need to increase the length of the following text, please send it to us. The news of the defeat at Trafalgar did not reach Napoleon immediately. When he was informed of the disaster, he flew into a rage, but tried to hide the scale of the tragedy from the French public. The newspapers gave only a brief description of the battle and underestimated the losses. However, the emperor understood perfectly well the strategic consequences of what had happened. His plan to invade England had collapsed completely and irrevocably. Without a fleet, a landing was impossible, and the Grand Army turned eastward from the English Channel. Napoleon was forced to seek glory on land, where his genius was still unmatched. He soon won a brilliant victory at Austerlitz, but Trafalgar remained a thorn in his side that he was never able to remove. Britain remained out of reach, continuing to finance his enemies and block trade. Trafalgar forced Napoleon to switch to a strategy of economic warfare, the continental blockade. He tried to strangle England by forbidding European countries from trading with it, but this decision ultimately turned all of Europe against him and led to the fateful campaign in Russia. Villeneuve, who was taken prisoner, was later released and returned to France. Unable to bear the shame and fear of the emperor's wrath, he committed suicide, although there were rumors of a secret murder. His fate became a sad epilogue to the history of the Franco-Spanish fleet. For Spain, the defeat marked the beginning of the end of its status as a great maritime power. The loss of its best ships and experienced sailors undermined its connection with its colonies in America. This accelerated the process of the collapse of the Spanish Empire. After Trafalgar, the British Navy became the absolute hegemon in the world's oceans. No country in the world dared to challenge it in a general battle for 100 years. This dominance ensured Britain's prosperity and security. Trafalgar showed that naval power is a key factor in global politics. Whoever controls the sea controls trade, and therefore the world. All future empires learned this lesson. Nelson's victory saved Britain from invasion, but the war continued for another 10 years. However, it was now fought on terms dictated by London. The sea became a British lake. Napoleon could win battles on land, but he found himself trapped on the continent. Trafalgar became the invisible barrier that he was never able to overcome. Nelson's body, preserved in a barrel of brandy, rumored to be rum, was brought to England aboard the Victory. The ship, still bearing the marks of fierce battle, entered the port slowly and solemnly, as if to emphasize the importance of the man it was bringing home. Flags were flown at half-mast, and everyone who saw the Victory understood that the country had lost its greatest sailor. People all over England talked about the admiral's death, and the country plunged into deep mourning as it welcomed its savior. The ship not only carried the hero's body, but also became a symbol of the end of an era. The sailors who accompanied Nelson's body recalled his last words, recounted the course of the battle, and how hard the victory had been won. Representatives of the Navy and the government were already waiting for them on shore, ready to ensure that the funeral was conducted with dignity. From the very beginning, it was clear that this ceremony would be an event unlike anything England had ever seen before. Preparations for the funeral took several weeks and became an unprecedented event. Never before had an admiral's body been given such a grand farewell ceremony. Nelson's coffin was placed in Greenwich, where thousands of people stood in line for hours. Some came from other cities to see, even for a moment, the man who had saved the country from the threat of invasion. The atmosphere was so poignant that even hardened sailors wept alongside ordinary citizens. The admiral's body was laid out for viewing in Greenwich, and an honor guard stood constantly beside the coffin. People approached in silence, many crossing themselves or bowing their heads, feeling the incredible solemnity of the moment. Nelson had long been a national hero, a man for whom people prayed when he went on campaigns, and whom they idolized after every victory. Now the people were saying goodbye not only to the admiral, but also to a part of their hope. The funeral procession in London was grand. It stretched across many streets of the city, turning the center of the capital into a huge stream of people. The coffin was carried on a special chariot, stylized as a ship, and this detail emphasized Nelson's entire maritime life, from his early years to his last days. Thousands of soldiers, sailors, and officers followed the chariot, many of whom had served under the admiral's command and could not hold back their tears. The streets were packed with crowds of weeping people, and the stream seemed endless. Londoners stood on rooftops and in windows to catch at least a glimpse of the procession. Many wore mourning ribbons, and black draperies were hung on houses. During those days, the city looked like one huge community, united in grief and respect for its hero. The service was held at St. Paul's Cathedral, which became the center of all mourning events. Inside the cathedral, representatives of the nobility, senior naval officers, and commanders who had served with Nelson gathered. Speeches were made about his exploits in life, each reminding the audience why his name had become legendary. The coffin was placed in the center of the huge temple, where the silence seemed almost sacred. Nelson was buried in a sarcophagus originally made for Cardinal Wolsey, a detail that added even more symbolism to the ceremony. The king, princes, and admirals bowed their heads before the grave of the son of a simple pastor, marking his incredible journey from an ordinary boy to the greatest naval commander. This funeral was the first state funeral of a non-royal on such a grand scale, and the country was proud of it. Nelson's death at the height of his glory made him almost immune to criticism. People spoke of him with reverence, and his mistakes and controversies in his personal life seemed to dissolve into the mists of the past. He became a symbol not only of victory but also of self-sacrifice, because he died at the moment when he led the country to its greatest triumph. His name became synonymous with bravery. All his mistakes and scandals in his personal life were forgotten, and the image of the admiral became ideal, almost mythical. He became the hero that the nation needed in difficult times. His figure embodied the national character, determination, and belief in one's own strength. And this is what made Nelson an eternal symbol of the British spirit. In honor of the victory and its creator, London's main square was renamed Trafalgar Square. It became the heart of the capital, a place where important events were celebrated and thousands of people gathered. In the center of the square, a majestic column with a statue of Nelson was erected. He stands high above the city and seems to continue looking toward the sea. The column became not only a monument to victory, but also a constant reminder of who ensured the country's security. The sculptors carefully recreated the admiral's appearance, trying to emphasize his determination and calmness. People often come to the square to look at him and remember the history that changed the fate of Europe. Monuments to Nelson appeared in many cities in Britain and its colonies. In each of them, residents saw a symbol of courage and patriotism that inspired generations. His famous signal, "England expects every man to do his duty," became the motto of sailors and soldiers who went into service remembering the words of their hero. These words were heard in both world wars, reminding people of the need for fortitude. He inspired sailors who went out to sea, knowing that Nelson's example would always accompany them. Commanders quoted his tactics, and images of his ships hung on the walls of naval schools. His name became part of British identity and a source of pride for many generations. The Victory was repaired and preserved as a monument so that future generations could see the ship that witnessed the greatest naval battle. After its restoration, it became a kind of open-air museum. Every plank and every deck is a reminder of those days when events that changed the course of history unfolded on board. Today, anyone can walk on the very deck where the admiral fell. This place has become a magnet for tourists, historians, and sailors who come here to feel a connection with the past. The Victory stands in Portsmouth as a living testimony to a great victory and a symbol of loyalty to duty. Nelson's legacy extends far beyond Britain. His tactics are studied in naval academies around the world, and many modern officers still analyze his maneuvers. He proved that decisiveness, quick decision-making, and the ability to break with tradition can turn the tide of any battle. His ideas became the foundation for new generations of navies in different countries. He proved that sometimes courage can be the deciding factor, even against superior enemy forces. Thanks to this, his name became not only a British symbol, but also a global symbol of naval valor. Many historians believe that Nelson's contribution to strategy and tactics was comparable to the achievements of the greatest land commanders. The story of Nelson's body being brought back and his funeral is the final chapter of a great drama. It combines victory, tragedy, and the gratitude of the people. The country gave its hero every honor it could. This ceremony marked the moment when a personality became a legend. It shows how a nation knows how to thank its defenders. The hero is gone, but his legend has become immortal, remaining part of the history not only of Britain, but of the whole world. The Battle of Trafalgar was a turning point not only in the war, but in world history as a whole. It marked the beginning of an era known as Pax Britannica, the British peace. The Royal Navy became the guarantor of freedom of navigation and the fight against piracy and the slave trade. The absence of serious competitors at sea allowed Britain to focus on expanding its colonial empire. Trade routes to India, America, and Asia were securely protected. British goods flooded world markets, fueling the Industrial Revolution at home. The French Navy never fully recovered from its defeat. Napoleon's attempts to build new ships were hampered by a lack of resources and experienced sailors. The sea ceased to be a factor in French strategy, which greatly limited the empire's capabilities. Naval tactics also changed forever. Line of battle tactics became a thing of the past, giving way to maneuverable combat aimed at destruction. Admirals became bolder, seeking not just to drive the enemy away, but to destroy them, as Nelson had done. The significance of Trafalgar is even felt in language. Expressions and terms from that era have entered everyday speech. The battle itself became the benchmark for decisive battles, against which all subsequent naval battles, such as Jutland and Midway, were compared. In the long term, Trafalgar contributed to the fall of Napoleon. Isolation from world resources and the inability to strike Britain exhausted France. The naval knot tied by Nelson around the empire's neck slowly but surely strangled it. However, the world was changing. Steam was replacing sail, and iron was replacing wood. But the spirit of Trafalgar, the spirit of the superiority of human will over circumstances, remained relevant. Technology changed, but the essence of war remained the same. Today we look at Trafalgar not just as a battle, but as the day that determined the direction of civilization for a whole century. It is a reminder of how fragile the balance of power in the world is, and of the role that individuals play in history. When we visit Trafalgar Square or look at the model of the ship Victory, we touch this history. We hear the echo of cannons and the creaking of masts. We remember the price paid for peaceful seas. The history of Trafalgar teaches us that even in the face of superior force, victory is possible with courage and intelligence. This is a lesson that will never become obsolete. The Battle of Trafalgar is not just a page in a history book. It is an event that shaped the world we live in. Nelson showed that one decisive blow can be worth a dozen protracted campaigns. His legacy is not only monuments, but also principles of leadership that are still relevant today. Did you enjoy this story about the greatest naval battle? Would you like to learn about other historical events where everything was decided in a single day? Suggest your topics in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new exciting stories.